This is the Brave New Coin Crypto Conversation, hosted by Andy Pickering.
Hi everyone, Andy Pickering here. I'm your host and welcome to the Crypto Conversation, a Brave New Coin podcast where we talk to the people building the future in the Bitcoin, blockchain and cryptocurrency space. Good news, team. We have an exciting new sponsor here at the Crypto Conversation, and well, they are perfectly positioned for today's changing investment environment. Because with market volatility so high and the expected returns for stocks and bonds so low, I tend to agree with the analysts at JP Morgan who have declared that alternative assets are no longer optional. And that is good news for those platforms who can provide access to the top alternative asset classes like Masterworks. Yes, Masterworks.io has solidified itself as the platform for investing in contemporary art. And Masterworks is on a mission to democratize art investing, which is a 1.7 trillion asset class. How do they do this? Well, Masterworks is the first platform to make it possible to purchase shares that represent an investment in multi-million-dollar artworks from iconic artists such as Banksy, Kaws, and Basquiat, all at a price point tailored to you. And since 2017, Masterworks has sold a number of iconic artworks, with each returning over 30% net IRR to investors. Legally, I have to follow that with past performance is no guarantee of future results. Now, if you want to get in early, just go to masterworks.art/cryptoconversations to skip their waitlist. That's masterworks.art/cryptoconversations. And you can see important Regulation A disclosures at masterworks.io/CD. And now it's on with the show. My guest today is Daniel Batten. Daniel is a technology entrepreneur. He is the creator of the Exponential Founders Fund. He's a philanthropist, a VC. He's a meditation teacher. He used to be an actor. He's quite an interesting character. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Yeah, cheers, Andy.
And he's also a Kiwi, so listeners...
I'm also a Kiwi.
He's also a Kiwi, so listeners will be used to my Kiwi accent. Always good to have a fellow Bitcoiner who's also a Kiwi on the show. Daniel, the reason you came on my radar, well, I'll just get this out of the way and it'll maybe set up the show, is I saw a couple of really interesting tweet threads or tweet storms, whatever you want to call them, from yourself. One was a month or two ago. It was about Greenpeace. We'll get to that later. And the other one was, of course, about Bitcoin mining and the potential for Bitcoin mining to encourage the kind of switch to renewable energy. So that's how you got on my radar. But in the course of just doing a little bit of research on you, New Zealand listeners, this might make sense to New Zealand listeners. Everyone else, please just indulge us. But Daniel, please explain the instant Kiwi ad that is on your website.
Oh yeah, that was my swan song as an actor. So in my 20s, I thought I was going to be an actor, and it never really panned out that way. Life went a different direction, and I had an agent for a long time. And I'd actually thrown in the towel and said, hey, look, I'm happy with the work that I'm doing. I was doing more work with technology entrepreneurs and really enjoying that. And I just said to my agent, look, I'm not going to do that anymore. And of course, the very next day, she said, there's just this one more thing. And I said, what is it? And that was the instant Kiwi ad, which is like a lotto commercial. And I got the part, actually, without even doing an audition. They saw some footage of a audition I did about a year ago, and they said, oh, he'd be perfect. He's just this kind of crazy, uncoordinated, unself-conscious person who dances in a way which cannot be described with words or with technique. And it just so happened to fit the brief. So yeah, I did that, and it was on for about a year, and I would get stocked in supermarkets and in shopping malls and all sorts of things. So that was my taste of the limelight.
Yeah, well, it is. I watched it again, and it is one of those iconic New Zealand ads. And so yeah, that was a bit of fun. I enjoyed watching that again.
Yeah, a lot of fun doing it too.
No doubt. So, all right. Well, let's start to get into it, Daniel, I think the best place to begin is what we always do at the beginning of the show is get you to please introduce yourself. So we've learnt a bit about you. You're an actor, and I did my spiel at the intro, but just, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to as a VC and a tech guy and so on.
Yeah, sure. So I started a technology company. I got into tech companies in the mid to late 90s. I joined what turned out to be an internet startup. I didn't know it at the time, but that's what it was. I didn't know there was such a thing. And then I took another role as an early employee in another tech startup. And I was like, this is fun. I want to start my own one. And I did with a friend. And yeah, we had a great team and we had some really good luck along the way. And that ended up going pretty well. And then I thought, okay, I feel like I'm ready for the next thing. And what I figured out I wanted to do was to help other technology entrepreneurs. And these days I do that in two ways. One is with capital, but the second way is with coaching. So I do a lot of coaching in the sector as well. And that's been what I spent a lot of the last 10 years doing. And so as an investor, I see a lot of technologies and I see a lot of the reasons that some technologies make it and some technologies don't. Some companies make it and some companies don't. And because we care about technology that does good for the world, we tend to specialize in clean tech and climate tech. That just seems like if you're going to go to all that effort to invest in a company, you might as well do something good for the world at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I suppose as someone who has dabbled in clean tech, then you probably know a little bit about the industry, and perhaps that's one reason why you've written this Twitter thread. So I want to spend a little bit of time going through this Twitter thread. For anyone who is unfamiliar with the thread, I'll put a link to the thread in the show notes. But let's get a bit of background in terms of your, I suppose, introduction to Bitcoin, Daniel, and when did you start to take a deeper interest in, proof of work and mining and how it works?
Yeah, far too late. I had a friend who was on at me about Bitcoin since about 2013, and it took me a while to actually sit up and take notes. So this was a trend I definitely missed until quite late in the piece. Apparently, it's still an early adopter time, but it didn't feel early to me. So it was about 2017, early to mid, before I actually got into Bitcoin. And that was in a reasonably small way, and then in a much bigger way at the end of 2020. And it was about then that I just got interested in it, firstly, really just as a speculative investment. But then the more I found out about this, the more I was, and everyone knows the same feeling, right? It's like, whoa, there's a whole rabbit hole here. There's a whole world here. There is much more to this than I thought. And so I just got fascinated with how it could be used to really create a fairer financial standard for the entire world. And I started to understand something I never understood that my friend had always been on at me about. And that was that you cannot create social change in the world unless you have financial change, unless you fundamentally change the financial structures we have. And it took a lot of reading and a lot of thinking to come to that conclusion. But once I came to it, I was like, this is the way of the future. And unless we go down this path, actually, we can't solve some of the world's problems.
All right, we've established that you're a clean tech investor, you're an environmentalist, it says in your Twitter bio, and you're a meditation teacher. Look, if we have time, we'll talk about that at the end of the show, because that's interesting in itself. But I guess the framing here is, well, it sounds like you'd be a member of Greenpeace, so we'll get to that as well. So from that lens, let's talk about your Twitter thread, I guess, and so it's called An Unexpected Superhero. The headline, the first thing you say, Daniel, is that Bitcoin mining can drive us to 70% renewables-based energy consumption by 2030. And you say Bitcoin mining is good for the environment. Well, saying Bitcoin mining is good for the environment is like saying that the sun is warm. So it's a nice provocative beginning. So what are you saying here, and what are you basing this on? And we'll start to go through it, Daniel.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a lot of consensus amongst people who are thinking really hard in the world right now about how you substantially reduce emissions. And the scientific consensus is that you've got to electrify everything. And this is something that's changed over the last 10 years, because 10 years ago, people had no idea that solar and wind and battery technology, the cost to produce that would drop at an exponential rate, which has driven, in some cases, exponential adoption, or at least close to exponential adoption in those technologies. And so we're actually seeing, if you look at the grid composition now, it's shocked everyone, because suddenly we're getting massive influxes of solar and of wind, which really no one but the futurists predicted 10 years ago. And so what that means is that you can start to build an incredibly big grid. But in order to build a grid, we live in a capitalist world, and things don't just get built to build them. There has to be demand, supply and demand, basic economics. So where's that demand going to come from? Well, it comes from a number of ways. It comes from electric vehicles, which have gone from 4% to 9% of the market. They're growing at an exponential rate. It comes from transitioning fossil fuel heating across to electric heating and heat pumps and all the rest of it. And it comes from some other things too. But then you get, if you actually look at it and you look at where we're getting stuck, then you start to find some really interesting things, which is that there are these grid operators which go by different names in different parts of the world. Sometimes they're state-owned, sometimes they're privately owned. In America, they're generally privately owned. And you start to look at where things are getting snagged. And there are $2 trillion worth of renewable projects right now in the pipeline, in the queue to get onto the grid. 2 trillion. If all of them got through the queue, that would be enough to drive America's zero, well, not zero emissions, but it would be enough to drive a lot of its climate goals. But here's the problem. Firstly, only 23% of them are getting approved. That's less than a quarter. And the second problem is it's taking 3.7 years for that approval to occur. That's way too slow. We haven't got that time. We're halfway towards 2030, which is a critical date according to the IPCC, before something's even got approved, let alone making a difference. So when we look at how do we start to unclog that backlog, and how do we encourage the grid operators to make some decisions faster to get behind these renewable technologies? You look at two things, and this is where I started to put on my investor hat, because I've been on both sides of the fence. I've been the person who's been financing new technologies, and I've been the person who's been asking to be financed. So I kind of get the application process. I get the psychology of decision making, and I get why, even if your technology looks really good, that a backer might say no to it. And it's real simple. It's risk and reward. And so we'll look at three things. In terms of the risk, there's two major risks when a grid operator is thinking about bringing on a new solar project or any new project. And that is, do you have customers and do you have capital? It's the usual suspects, right? Just like a tech company. Do you have any customers and do you have capital? And what Bitcoin mining does is it fundamentally adjusts that risk equation. Because I'll give you an analogy. Imagine I'm a property developer and you're the banker, and I come to you and I've got this great new proposal for this property development that I do. And then as the banker, you ask a killer question, which is, have you sold any of these units in this apartment off the plans? Now, do you think my answer to that question is going to make a difference to whether you fund me or not? It's going to make a massive difference, right? Because it's the difference between suddenly you proving you've got an income stream versus not. So it's going to de-risk things considerably in the eyes of the person who's looking to invest in you.
Yeah.
Same way when you're a technology company, you go to an investor and you say, do you have any customers yet? And you say, yes, we've got one and they're paying us. We've got annual recurring revenues of $1 million versus the company that has nothing. Then you've suddenly de-risked it a whole lot. So for a utility scale solar or wind operator to be able to go to a grid operator and say, we have a customer, which is our Bitcoin miner, It's a very special sort of customer in two ways. Number one, they've got an insatiable appetite. They can take all the energy that we can initially produce for a certain amount of time. Secondly, they can co-locate right next to us, which means that we don't need to interconnect the solar farm to the grid before we can start bringing in revenue. So we can start bringing in revenues right away. Now, suddenly that proposition's gone from looking risky to looking less risky. And then the solar operator does the second thing, which is then they go to their financier. Maybe it's a bank, maybe it's an investor, maybe it's capital, maybe it's debt financing. And they say, they show the plans, and the financier looks at the revenue stream and they can say, okay, you've got revenue coming in from this Bitcoin miner. You've got it coming in even before you connect to the grid. So that's accelerating your returns. You've got a steady revenue coming in. That's increasing your profitability. You've got a customer. Now, suddenly, this is not looking like some plan that has high risk. This is actually looking relatively low risk. And so they're more likely to fund it. So now you've got two things. You've got a customer and you've got capital. And then you go to the grid operator and you've just taken the two biggest risks for the grid operator off the table. Now, there's some other massive risks as well that Bitcoin mining can't take off the table, such as resource consent and where you're located relative to the grid and those sorts of grid supply and demand considerations. So there are a whole lot of risks you cannot take off the table, but there are two very important ones you can. So that's the first bit. And then
yeah, and so you talked about, you mentioned the year 2030, Daniel, and the IPCC, and I think the context there is that if we do nothing or just continue as on a business as usual approach, which, to be fair or unfair, it kind of seems that is the way we're heading at the moment. If that is the case, then by the year 2030, the IPCC says we'll have runaway climate change, and that's when things start to look a bit grim, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. We're heading to around 28% renewables at the current trajectory. That's not enough. We've got to be more like 70%.
Yeah.
To prevent runaway climate change. So this is where we look at and we say, how can we accelerate? How can we stop these queues? How can we provide an economic incentive for more people to connect to the grid who are renewable, and for the grid operators to say yes more often than 23% of the time after 3.7 years?
And you talk about, Daniel, something called the activation energy barrier as something additional that's needed in this energy mix. What's the activation energy barrier?
So this is an idea. The activation energy barrier is something that exists everywhere in nature and in commerce. So in chemistry, it's what stops two reagents from reacting together, forming a chemical reaction. In life, it's what stops you and me from forming a new habit, because there's a certain amount of energy required to form that new habit. And in the grid, it's about, there's a certain amount of activation energy that is required in order for someone who's deciding to add you to the grid to say yes to it. And so the idea is, if you have a catalyst, what a catalyst does is it helps you to go through that energy activation barrier, and it lowers the amount of energy that's required in order for someone to say yes to your ideas. And so that's where we look in terms of two things: risk. Are we decreasing risk in the eyes of people who can connect you to the grid? And are we increasing the reward, which is a bit we'll talk about in a minute, to the people who are connecting you to the grid?
Gotcha. That makes sense. Well, talk about the reward then. So I think I know where you're going, but explain that.
Well, there's three things. If you look at what grid operators care about around the world, there's three things.
Yeah.
Reliability. You want a reliable grid. You don't want a grid which is having brownouts or blackouts. And it's actually just as bad. A lot of people don't understand this. It's just as bad to have a grid which has not enough demand as a grid with too much demand. Because if you don't have enough demand, then you've got to actually shut off the people who are producing power. And if you do that, you've actually got to pay them. You've got to compensate them for asking them to curtail their energy production. So it actually costs you. And so reliability is super important. And the other side of the equation, because of renewable energy, we have this phenomenon where now solar, for example, most of it's produced in the middle of the day, but that's not when most people want energy. When most people want energy is about 6 to 7 o'clock in the evening, when everyone switches on everything. And that's when the sun's starting to fade out. It's set in the winter and it's lost most of its heat in the summer. So we've got this mismatch. So the first thing is reliability. The second thing is profitability. And the third issue is to decarbonize the grid. And depending on which part of the world you're in, if you're in Germany, their number one priority will be decarbonizing. If you're in the UK, which is a private grid operator, the national grid, their primary objective looks like profitability. If you're in the eastern states of the US, they say in their presentations that we care more about reliability of the grid than profitability. So these criteria are there. So what Bitcoin mining does is a couple of things. It actually hits all three. It decarbonizes the grid because it incentivizes the build out of renewable energy by taking risk off the table. So grid operators can say yes to more renewable plants being built out. So it's helping to decarbonize the grid by lowering the concentration of fossil fuels. There's a second way that it decarbonizes the grid, though, and that's what typically happens at the moment. You get to that peak hour where suddenly everyone's switching on everything at once. Then what typically a grid operator will do is say, okay, we're going into a risk of having to do blackouts. We have to increase supply. And what do they use? They have a gas turbine because that's the quickest, simplest way to get additional supply. It's expensive for the grid operator. It's expensive for consumers. And of course, it's not carbon neutral. It's anything but. Now, if you have Bitcoin miners in the mix, two things are true. Number one is, now this is a misnomer. A lot of people think, because there's a lot of myths out there, that, Bitcoin miners are these people who are going to take away energy from people who need it. And that's actually not true. It's not in Bitcoiners' economic interests to compete for energy, because when you're competing, things get more expensive, supply and demand, right? So if I'm trying to do Bitcoin mining where everyone else is using power, suddenly my costs have gone up enormously. And if you think Bitcoin's volatile, just wait till you see how wholesale electricity rates can spike and drop during a given day. So they go up. And with Bitcoin mining, it's a very simple process where your profitability is determined by one thing primarily. And that's not the price of Bitcoin, it's the more volatile thing. That's the price of electricity. And so the moment that electricity prices spike, the last thing you want to do is be competing. So it's in your advantage to say, hey, we're going to shut down tools. And that's what they do. Either because they voluntarily do it or because they have an existing agreement with the grid operator who actually says, hey, can you switch off tools? And here's the cool thing. The grid operator now, rather than switching off that gas turbine or switching it on, can ring up these people and say, we need you to switch off all your mining equipment in seconds. Can you do it? Bitcoin miner says, yep, we can. And they do. Yes. And they actually do. They're that responsive. So it's a very unique type of customer. You can't ask a data center operator to do that. They're in the middle of some big process. They'll lose that data. But a Bitcoin miner, you can.
That's right, Daniel. And the Bitcoin miners in Texas have exactly that relationship that you've explained. And by doing that, they smooth out the grid. They get all that extra capacity that is there, and when it's needed, and they can plug off their machines very quickly at a time when the supply is not meeting the residential demand, if you like. But and I guess situations like that, and because part of the problem here, of course, Daniel, is if you've kind of identified a possible solution, and sure, it's a big picture solution over a long time period. A lot of these puzzle pieces need to come into play, and part of the problem is the narrative that obviously proof of work and Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment. Now that narrative is slowly changing. So for example, through like the situation in Texas, and you've got some like Ted Cruz, some politicians are really taking up the cause to kind of promote Bitcoin mining. Texas is just one example. I saw the IMF and International Monetary Fund, they published a report yesterday on the global financial stability report, I think it was. But in that report, they acknowledged, they talked about the usual, risks and so on with blockchain protocols. But they also said they were noticing a trend of countries, brands, and companies being able to monetize their energy resources through Bitcoin mining. So it is starting to happen, this shift in narrative, right?
Yeah. One of the hardest things for an environmentalist like me to wrap my head around is that the answer to reducing carbon emissions is not to conserve energy universally, but to conserve it selectively. And because we're brought up to conserve everything, right? Turn off the light, do this, don't be so wasteful. And it's more nuanced than that, because now that we have this electrification of everything in the grid, it's a two-step plan where step one is we want to replace everything that currently uses fossil fuels with electric. And then, of course, that's only going to work if we're generating our power with clean sources of electricity. So we have to do both. We have to convert from fossil fuels, so our fossil fuel cars, into electric vehicles. And in parallel, we have to be making sure that that grid is supplied by renewable energies at the same time. And the only way that we're going to get that grid up and to the size we need it to be to meet our renewable targets is we have to have more demand. So we want to be decreasing our use of things that require fossil fuels. And at the same time, we actually want more demand on our grid. So Bitcoin mining is perfect because it places a demand on electricity. And this helps to build out, because remember, you can only get additional supply if you've got additional demand. They go hand in hand. So it's my only concern really is Bitcoin mining requiring enough electricity to help us build out that grid to the extent we need to?
Yes, and because if you take a step back, Daniel, and you think of the let's call it the directional arrow of progress, let's call it the evolution of humanity over time as we kind of slowly evolve into, let's say, a spacefaring civilization. The only way to get there, and it will take a long time, but the only way to get there is to produce, generate, and control more and more exponentially more amounts of energy. You can't go backwards; you can only go forwards, and it's just a matter of efficiency. Sure, we've got to figure out ways to do it in clean and efficient way, but part of that mix is also going to be nuclear in the short term, I think, and you can see there's a real narrative shift happening there as well. What's his name? I think Josh Wolf, the big VC guy. He's always talking on Twitter about how we need to rebrand nuclear power to elemental power, which I quite like.
Yeah, I kind of, I've had a look at nuclear, and you know what, in terms of, it doesn't follow the exponential curve. And if you look at what's happened, there's a great graph from our World and Data that is showing that the nominal cost to produce solar power, wind power, battery power is all going down. Coal, it's about the same. Nuclear is actually requiring more cost to produce. Okay. And so it's not our great hope. The great hopes are the ones that are coming down in cost exponentially. Yes. And that's batteries, that's solar, and that's wind generation.
Okay, so if that's the case, then we'll come back to wind in a second. Fascinated by, so there's I'm not sure where it is, but there's a trial mining operation. It's a collaboration between Block, which used to be Square, Jack Dorsey's Bitcoin company. It's between Block, Blockstream, and Tesla. It's in Texas. I've found it. It's an off-grid solar-powered Bitcoin mine in Texas. So they're using it's a combination of Tesla batteries and solar, and so if they can get this solar powered mine going efficiently, as I understand it, they're going to share there'll be a public dashboard that shares all the metrics and how much Bitcoin's being produced and how much energy it requires and all that good stuff. So I think it's experiments like that will be absolutely fascinating and critical to this being successful. You talked about wind. What are the Roaring Forties, and what especially as it relates to the Roaring Forties relates to our part of the world, Daniel?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So most of New Zealand is more than half of the landmass of New Zealand is in the roaring 40s. So in other words, a latitude of 40 degrees or more. And at that particular latitude, you get a lot of wind, as anyone who lives in those latitudes, such as Wellington, will tell you. And so we have some of the optimal conditions in the world for wind generation. You'd never know it. You'd be lucky if you see a windmill anywhere. And so New Zealand's kind of fortunate in that 80% of our grid right now is renewables, and that's because we have this massive hydro capacity. And it's like it's double-edged sword. We're so fortunate that we've kind of taken it a little bit for granted. So if you look at what people in Germany have done, for example, with massive deployment of wind energy, or Denmark, which is now 47% of their grid is wind energy, and they've achieved that ahead of schedule just through political will. We haven't done that in New Zealand. And so there's a huge opportunity for us to actually build a grid and say, hey, look, we've got EVs, electric vehicles, they're growing at an exponential sales rate. We can convert a lot of our old gas heaters and fossil fuel-based heating and industry over to electric. But to do that, we've got to be thinking big. We've got to be thinking not about the capacity today, but we've got to be thinking what happens when our electricity demands double because we're replacing fossil fuel with electricity. We can't build more dams easily. We're not going to go nuclear in this country. We're nuclear free. We're certainly not going to build more diesel generators. So what are we going to do? It has to be wind and it has to be solar. And so again, Bitcoin mining comes into the fray really importantly here, because at the moment you can only do that if you're a utility. And if we're going to rely on the utility companies to derive innovation and to drive speed, well, we might be out of luck. So we need independent operators to come in. And our independent operators, they have the will, but they don't have the customers that utilities do. But again, if they have the Bitcoin miner, who's that first customer, then suddenly the cost equation looks a whole lot better. And then they can do something else. They can go to the utility company. And what typically happens at the moment is you have these things called power purchase agreements, which is an agreement between the person who sets up the solar farm or the wind farm and the utility company. And it's a pre-agreement that the utility will pay a certain rate for the power they get. And one of the clauses is called a curtailment clause, which is that if the utility can't handle the amount of power that's been generated, then that solar plant or that wind plant will shut off and the utility will compensate the operator. Now, of course, utilities don't like doing that, but it's part of what they do in order to get a guaranteed price of electricity. So they do it. But again, if you've got a Bitcoin miner, the amount of curtailment you're going to have to do is going to go down. And that's great for the utility, because now the utility, they don't have to pay those costs. And of course, when the utility pay their costs, guess who they hand them on to? They hand them on to the consumers. And it's also better because now that solar or wind operator can negotiate a better deal because they don't have that curtailment clause. So the economics of it just stack up so much better. The moment you put that Bitcoin miner into the picture and you couple them, just as Block and Blockware and Tesla have done together, where you've got this combined solution. It's a perfect synergy.
Yes, Daniel, I very much agree. And, again, the problem, if we use New Zealand as an example, you can, and again, it comes back to that narrative problem at the moment. You just feel that mainstream New Zealand is probably not ready for Bitcoin mining operations at scale. But it would just take someone like, Chloe Swarbrick or someone like that, who is a local politician. She's probably going to be the leader of the Green Party here in New Zealand. If someone like her was to kind of champion these causes and kind of lead that narrative shift, things can happen quickly. Which reminds me, I did want to just touch on Greenpeace briefly, Daniel. So, of course, this stems from, I think, what's his name, Mr. Larson, who is Chris Larson. He's one of the co-founders at Ripple / XRP, and he's obviously done very well out of XRP, but he's started this campaign in the US. I think it's called something like Change the Code. not the climate. That's
Yeah,
change the code, not the climate. That's what it's called. And so the idea is they want to, they'd like Bitcoin to change from proof of work to something else, proof of stake, presumably. And it's a little bit of a disingenuous pitch coming from, the co-founder of XRP to be suggested, you know what I'm saying. So what were your thoughts on this, and why did you decide to write this thread? Because the link here is that Greenpeace are kind of backing Mr. Larson's campaign here. There's a link, right?
Yeah. Well, they've gone in together to create this campaign called Change the Code. So the first thing I want to say is that I'm not completely surprised, because when I first read some of the articles in the media about Bitcoin's energy usage, which have no scientific basis whatsoever, but nonetheless, that's not what's important. What's important, if you create a narrative often enough and you repeat it often enough, then people start to believe it. And so I was starting to as well. And I remember talking to my friend who got me into Bitcoin, and it was just after I bought it, and I saw these articles and I was like, hey, dude, what do you think of this? This doesn't sound good. And fortunately, he was able to send me a couple of links to some very smart people who had done the analysis, which is something that no one in the media has done. All they're doing is circulating myths without any investigative journalism whatsoever. And so I went to the source of it, and I started to realize just how this whole bigger equation, which was that unless we can build out the grid, we cannot solve some of our most pressing issues. And Bitcoin can absolutely, not only can, but does, many instances, help renewable operators who otherwise might not have got approval to get approval to hook up to the grid. I think Greenpeace are doing a great job in every area except their attack on Bitcoin. And my encouragement to anyone from Greenpeace who's listening is twofold. Number one is to actually do the analysis, to do the maths, to go to the science on it, not the FUD, not the myths. Because I think that we have an obligation, if we're talking about things as serious as climate change, we as environmentalists don't like it when someone comes up with fake climate change narratives that are saying it's not happening. We tend to get pretty pissed off. In the same way, Bitcoiners really don't like it when there are these attacks on Bitcoin that just are not based on any analysis. They're not based on maths. They're not based on science. What are they based on? Perpetuating myths. So I think it's important that we have the standard that if we're going to do things for the environment, we understand what we're talking about. And it's quite clear at the moment that that's not the case. And when it's very apparent, because the moment someone says, hey, Bitcoin should change to proof of work, what they're really telling you is, I don't understand Bitcoin. Because no one who understands Bitcoin and what it is and why it's there will ever have that as a recommendation. It's not even possible, but even if it was, they wouldn't say it.
No, that's right. Bitcoin's energy use is, in fact, a feature, not a bug. Yep. Yes. Look, this has been a lot of fun, Daniel. I'm conscious of time. I want to go to a break and then come back and finish off. We'll do the very famous crypto conversation hot take round. Let's just close this part of the podcast off. How do we do that? I don't know. What is there anything that kind of needs to happen? Do we need some kind of tipping point, some kind of trigger point? Do we need another Michael Saylor, another Elon Musk, someone to come along and change the game, change the narrative again, or do we just rely on these economic incentives slowly and then suddenly becoming inescapable?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to know exactly what's going to drive things forward. Like you can always speculate, and you can think, like if you look back 2 years ago, you wouldn't have predicted that El Salvador would have adopted as a nation state Bitcoin. You wouldn't have imagined that this little company, who's not so little, called MicroStrategy, would suddenly have doubled down and not only put all of their corporate treasury into Bitcoin, but to raise bonds to get more Bitcoin with the Bitcoin they have as collateral. you wouldn't have imagined that we'd have a futures ETF. And yet all these things happen within a year. So it's kind of hard to know exactly when things will happen. I think all we can really do is we keep on just spending an effort to really educate people about Bitcoin. And that's twofold. Number one, it's educating them about why it's important, because I think something is really easy to attack if you think it's frivolous, if you think it's speculative, if you think it's only for libertarians who want to make money, which is a lot of the false narrative that goes around Bitcoin. And whereas when you understand that actually it's a method for giving freedom and hope to most of the world who does not live in a liberal Western democracy, but does not have a financial system where they are subject to hyperinflation, or if they get involved in the wrong protests, they can have their assets frozen, or they get remittances sent from overseas in order to keep their family surviving, and they see 20% of that taken from Western money order remittance fees. Or they're a war refugee, and the only reason they have any money at all to set up in a new country is because they had Bitcoin. And you start to look beyond your Western privilege to actually what happens in the 3/4 of the world who don't live in liberal Western democracies. You start to see pretty soon that Bitcoin is absolutely required for the world. And then you start to look at what's happening in Western liberal democracies, and you start to say, hang on, I'm not so sure that my finances are censorship resistant and surveillance resistant and freezing resistant in even my country anymore. And so I think two things. Number one, we've got to just show people why it's critically important, and social change cannot occur without financial change. And number two, that we just have to have the patience to sit down and talk people through some of the beliefs they may have, which are based on things they've read, which were not anchored in fact, and have the patience just to talk people through. I think both things will be super important.
Very much agree. Very much agree. And I think just even though, as we kind of, spend our days scrolling through crypto Twitter, it's very easy to I think that things are kind of just a little bit stagnant, particularly when the market is stagnant. But, just some of those, as you've alluded to, the kind of the speed at which things are happening is actually much faster than a lot of Bitcoiners would ever have dared dream. Early on in the piece, we've seen what's happening with El Salvador. Futures ETF in the US, Australia have two spot-based ETFs that go live.
They did that 24 hours ago. Good on them.
So there's lots happening. All right. Well, this is let's go to a very quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll finish off with the very famous Crypto Conversation hot take round. Back in one sec.
Here's what's being said about Masterworks.
My name is Jacob Ben. I'm from Long Island, and I've invested over $73,000 with Masterworks. My portfolio performance just wasn't cutting it. I researched all these alternative investments, like crypto and NFTs, but they didn't make sense to me. Then I read about Masterworks in Forbes, and I signed up right away. And now you can too. Thanks, Masterworks.
Get VIP access at masterworks.io and use promo code JACOB. See important disclosures at masterworks.io/DC.
All right, we are back, and I'm with Daniel Batten. He's a New Zealand-based tech guy, and he's a Bitcoiner, and we've been talking Greenpeace, renewable energy, Bitcoin, a whole lot of stuff. And Daniel, I like to finish each podcast with a quick round of rapid-fire crypto conversation hot takes. Are you up for it?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so I'm just going to fire off some questions at you. No right or wrong way to do this. Just want your honest opinions, kind of hot take style. The first question, Daniel, is where would you say you sit on the Bitcoin maximalist to multi-chain opportunist spectrum?
I would say 75% maximalist. I do have some Ethereum.
Yep.
But I don't believe that it's going to solve the world's money.
No problem. All good. Daniel, what would you say is your firmest conviction, crypto opinion?
Oh, that's a good one. I would say that Bitcoin is a force for creating the build out of renewable energies in the world.
I love it. All right. Daniel, you'll be familiar with this concept as a tech guy. You may even be familiar with the gentleman himself, Mr. Bill Gates, who famously said that we tend to overestimate what we can accomplish in 2 years and underestimate what we can accomplish in 10. So with that in mind, I mean, whatever you like here, blockchain, Bitcoin, Web3, what does it look like in 10 years' time?
Oh man, that's a really tough one. There's some people who are really good at being futurists and predicting that. I would say, if I was to speculate, and this is very speculative.
It's all speculative. Don't worry, Daniel. That's why it's fun.
I can see that when we look at trends, that actually the developing world is going to adopt it first. And this is going to bring a lot of freedom to these developing worlds. It's going to bring freedom from crippling IMF loans. It's going to bring more political freedom from oppressive regimes. And it's going to bring just a lot of empowerment to a lot of people. And I think if we look at what that causes, I think what we're not really asking ourselves is, what's that going to do when suddenly you have a whole lot of people who can participate in a censorship-resistant, surveillance-resistant, peer-to-peer financial system who couldn't before. I think we're going to see just huge innovations and empowerment in the developing world.
Hard to argue with that. I completely agree. The flip side of that, of course, Daniel, is an equally famous quote, this one from sci-fi author William Gibson, who said that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. With that in mind, can you think of an example of the future being here right now, but most people just aren't really aware of it?
Yeah. Something I found out just yesterday, and that is that our landfills are apparently, this is according to NASA data, emitting, in some cases, up to 6 times more methane than we thought. And what that means is that the global contribution to greenhouse gases of landfills is around 7.5%, which is huge. And I did a bit of research, and it turns out already there's a Bitcoin mining operation who has already seized that opportunity and is looking into landfill gas, that they convert that methane into carbon dioxide, which of course you still don't want carbon dioxide, but methane's like 80 times worse than carbon dioxide. So given the choice between methane and carbon dioxide, I'm going to take carbon dioxide any day. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Just really innovative uses of Bitcoin to reduce some of the real killer greenhouse gases and just give us some more runway. It's not the ultimate solution, but it buys us more time. I think we'll see more of that.
I love it. All right, time to get weird, time to zoom out. Daniel, what do you see as the long-term future for the human race? Do you see dystopia or utopia?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that it's that both are possible. I'm an optimist by nature. I absolutely think that we have the ability to turn the dial in the better direction, let's say. I don't think we'll ever have utopia or complete dystopia. I think if you look through history, we've always had a mix of both, because society just tends to mirror the state of our own, the sum total of our individual consciousness. And unless everyone is completely enlightened or everyone is completely evil, which I don't think is ever going to happen, we're never going to have perfect utopia or perfect dystopia. So I think we're just going to see more pockets. One thing I will say is that with every challenge, you have people who rise up to meet that challenge, and that's a great thing. And every disaster, you have people who come in and help to relieve that disaster, and as aid workers. And with a climate issue that we have right now, then people are coming together to think more innovatively than ever before. And so I think that'll cause a lot of hope. And one final thing on that is that we don't, as humans, tend to understand exponential growth that well.
Yes.
And all the projections for like solar and wind and battery have all been wrong, and they've been wrong by an order of magnitude. And all of our beliefs about what's possible for the driving of renewables has been wrong by an order of magnitude, and that's because we haven't understood exponential. So I have a lot of hope that some of the things that seem ridiculous as measurements in terms of targets that are actually achievable by the exponential principle.
Yeah, I love that, Daniel, and yeah, I mean that's kind of been it's been a recurring theme that I've come back to a number of times on this podcast. Is that it's just a fact of the way that humans are wired. We're not wired to understand exponential growth. We need it explained to us, but that's why it is. It's the proverb about the rice grains on the chessboard. It doesn't make any sense, but. That's how networks work, that's how technology networks scale, and they hit those S-curves, things go exponential, and so it does kind of mean that as far as the future goes, all bets are off. The future is wide open. It really is up to us to make the best of it. The power is in all of our hands. Daniel, this has been a lot of fun. Have enjoyed talking to you today. There's nothing else to say. Oh no, there's one final question. How remiss of me. Daniel, the last question here on the Crypto Conversation Hot Take Round. It is, what is your favourite science fiction book, film, TV show, or universe? So I got distracted talking about exponential growth.
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, excellent. We'll go with Blade Runner. Gotta love Blade Runner. All right, take us out, Daniel. Please tell the people where they can go to find you on Twitter or wherever else you like to hang out on the internet. And look, any closing thoughts, please feel free.
Yeah, I hang out mostly on Twitter these days, so it's at DS Batten. You'll find me talking about this sort of stuff and other things there.
Awesome. Look, hey, I'm sure we'll do this again sometime, but thanks very much, Daniel. All the best, and bye for now.
Yeah, cheers, Andy.
All right, there you go. That was Daniel Batten, just having some fun talking Bitcoin, energy, the switch to renewables. Kind of have a feeling it will all work out, but I don't know. It's a volatile time in the world. I'm sure you've noticed. I think it's going to be a volatile time for the next decade or two. Come to think of it, when has it not been a volatile time in the world? I think the world is a volatile place. No getting around with that. All right, let's not babble at the end of the show. Let's close this out. Thank you very much for listening, team. If you did enjoy the show, please don't forget to subscribe to the Crypto Conversation in whatever podcast app you are using. Please also give us a nice 5-star rating in Apple iTunes, Apple Podcasts. Always appreciate that. All right. Thanks. That is today's show. This was the Crypto Conversation for Brave